All right, this is moving into late medieval now. This is around the same time as the late Gothic or the High Gothic. And we start to see images or figures appearing more natural, no longer the tall, thin figures of the Byzantium. Byzantium is struggling, and northern Italy is dominated by few independent, wealthy city-states and controlled by very powerful families. Florence and Rome become the banking capital of Europe, and textile and wool trade are also extremely important. The Black Death, or the plague, is decimated a third to half of the population in Italy, and the Pope is at the pinnacle of his power during this time. In 1200, St. Francis is active, which is important because it introduces us to the idea of the suffering Christ. We saw that a little bit when we talked about the Pietà in northern Europe, but we haven't seen that here in the south, in Italy. And so in 1204, Constantinople was captured by the Crusaders, and as a result of that, Byzantium, the artists fled out of there and came south. So there were a lot of artists wanting work coming to Italy. Okay, and so with them they bring books that are in Greek rather than in Latin, because they're coming from the Byzantium. And with that they bring philosophy and mathematics, and they're expanding the philosophical and intellectual concepts by just coming together between the two, between Latin and Greek. And the ideas of humanism, the revival of the classical values, are coming back from ancient Mediterranean cultures. And there's great wealth, growing individualism within artists, meaning that they are starting to become independent and self-aware of their needs, people wanting to hire artists, and also knowing that they can make money, having an economic understanding and some social freedom. In the 14th century, Italy consisted of these numerous city-states and functioning independently. So you had these little states that ended up being like little countries in its own right. And some of them were warring against each other. So depending on where they were located geographically would depend on who was in control of them. So if you're around Florence, then probably your major city Florence is going to be controlling you. And many were controlled and governed by oligarchies. So by the beginning of the 14th century, in Italy had established a thriving international trade in the Mediterranean world, because you're right there on the coast. Let's look at the map. And so you can see here, we're up here in Florence, close to the water here and over here as well. So the transition from medieval to the Renaissance period occurred in the 14th century, the 1300s. And this revival of interest in the classical art, antiquity, ancient Roman sculptures and Greek sculptures, and architecture, for example, were locally available by artists because they're right there in Italy, so you can see what had been done in the past. The result was a new, more naturalistic art in both figure and in the surrounding. So they're losing that thinness. They're losing those big, wide eyes, and you're starting to see a more full body. So guilds had started in the 10th century and had become quite powerful, and so depending on what craft you were, you would have your own guild. So bakers, cobblers are shoemakers, carpenters, stonemasons, painters, sculptors, all of those had their own guilds. And so you would choose a profession, and that's what you were for life. So there wasn't a lot of jumping around. Plus, people didn't live as long as they do today. So a master craftsman, made it all the way to the end, but there were very few of those. And so you would start as an apprentice, and then move up to a journeyman. And journeymen were usually the people that painted the backgrounds. Apprentices did all the prep work. They grinded and mixed paint, run errands, things like that. And the journeymen would be painting the background, parts of bodies, whereas the masters would paint the face, the hair, all the really beautiful portions of the body. So it was like an assembly line. You have a couple paintings going at the same time and lots of different people working on one painting at a time. And different parts of the country, Italy, Florence, Siena, would have a different look, a different style. And so coming to here, the Byzantine influence is obviously strong. When you look at Madonna Enthroned with Angels and Prophets, you can see it looks very Byzantium in style, but our bodies are becoming fuller. And they're not all tall, thin, sharing this very small space. You can see we've got this gold background, which is the same. And there's even gold in the drapery, in her long, thin fingers still. Proportions are somewhat Byzantine, but we're moving away from that a little bit. So he's challenged some of the major conventions of the time of the late medieval art in pursuit of this naturalism, because a lot of artists at this time weren't making as full of a body as he was. He painted Madonna Enthroned with Angels and Prophets for Santa Trinita in Florence, and this would have been an altarpiece. So it would have been hung high so that from the background, so if you're walking in through the narthex of the church, you would have been able to see it. And that's part of the reason why it's so big. I mean, you can see it's 12 feet, 7 inches by 7 feet, 4 inches wide, which is a very large painting. The composition and gold background reveal the painter's reliance on the Byzantine models, because that's what we're coming out of and moving into the early Renaissance. The elaborate throne has no visible support, and the back, it just looks like we can see it from the front, but there's nothing in the back. It sort of seems, it's sort of like we still have a little bit of that heavenly space, but we're starting to see more of a material world come forward. Cimabue also creates a deep space for the Madonna surrounding figures and inhabit what was common in Byzantine art. So even though you still have kind of a cramped space, you still have a little bit more room to work with than we did, for instance, in the early icons in the 7th century. The viewer seems suspended in space, simultaneously looking down on the projecting elements. So you're kind of looking down on the prophets below, but we're looking straight ahead at her, at Mary. And so it's interesting the different views that this is creating. The Virgin's throne, for example, is massive in size, and Cimabue convincingly depicted its receding in space. So we have a little bit of perspective here, meaning that you can see space a little bit better. Whereas if you remember from the Byzantine, everything was extremely flat on the surface. The overlapping bodies of the angels on the side of the throne and the half-length profiles of the prophets below reinforce this sense of depth, which we really began to see and explore in the Renaissance. So in looking at the two from the 7th century and here, you can see quite a difference. But you still can see the influence of the Byzantine with the gold and the figures. You still don't see bodies, although we're starting to see a little bit of body here. We can see their legs, we can see his belly, and we can see his legs. So we're starting to see that return of humanism.